Clara sat alone in the train car, hands folded tightly in her lap, the embroidered handkerchief in her hand damp from her nervous grip. The rhythmic clatter of the rails had long lost their hypnotic charm. For 2 days she had stared out the window, watching the dusty horizon inch closer to the place that might become her new home. She had answered an ad in the back of a St. Louis newspaper, a rancher out west, seeking a wife, a man named Jedediah Brooks. She was 43, no longer young by most standards, but still steady of hand and sound of mind. Her heart, despite its many bruises, still beat with hope. When the train pulled into the station, the town looked as unforgiving as she feared. Wooden buildings, warped signs, and faces worn by sun and labor. No one smiled. She stepped off carefully, her boots touching Arizona dust for the first time. A man leaned against a post near the telegraph office. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair and a clean-shaven jaw. She recognized him from the daguerreotype he'd mailed, a rare luxury. It was Jed. He squinted at her. His eyes narrowed further when she approached, dress neatly pressed and bonnet shading her graying hair. "You Clara?" he asked, the tone flat. "I am," she replied, extending her gloved hand. He looked her up and down. The silence thickened. "You look older than your letter made it seem." Clara's breath caught. "I didn't hide my age. I said I was born in 39. "Still," he muttered, "didn't expect someone mature." She stood straight. "I've lived, Mr. Brooks. I know how to run a home, cook, tend wounds, and keep accounts." "That's so," he said, unmoved. "I need someone who can raise children, Clara, not someone who's already seen hers grow." Her lips parted to respond, but nothing fitting came. The bustling platform blurred around her. "I'll pay your fare back," he added softer. "Wasn't trying to be cruel. Just thought we were clear." Clara's jaw tightened. She shook her head. "I don't want your money. I came here on my own." "Suit yourself," he said, tipping his hat and walking away without another word. Left standing in the hot sun, Clara stared at his retreating figure. Around her, people bustled past without pause. She walked slowly to the end of the platform, lifting her trunk with some difficulty. No one offered help. She found a small boarding house on the edge of town, run by a tight-lipped widow named Mrs. Blanchard. The room was plain, the wallpaper peeling at the corners, but it was dry and quiet. Clara paid for 3 nights and sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, staring at the cracked ceiling. By morning, she decided not to leave. There was no one back in Missouri waiting. She inquired about work, and by the end of the day was taking on laundry from the saloon and helping prepare bread in the early hours. Her hands worked without complaint, though her heart bruised quietly beneath the surface. People noticed her, not kindly. The saloon girls snickered when she passed. A man once asked if she'd been stood up by the mail. She said nothing, meeting their gazes with unflinching calm. Every night, she sat in the narrow window of her rented room, watching the town settle into night. On her 5th morning, while hauling a bundle of clean linens, Clara passed the blacksmith shed. A man emerged from the shadowed doorway. He paused, looked at her. She nodded politely and continued on. Something in his eyes gave her pause, curious, observant, but not mocking. Later that evening, he came to the boarding house for supper, taking a quiet seat at the far table. Mrs. Blanchard called him Boone. He wore his coat despite the heat, and Clara noticed the way his left arm moved, stiff, partial. A scar traced down the left side of his face. He ate with his head down and left before the room grew loud. For days after, she saw him again and again, never speaking more than a few words, but always watching with the calm patience of someone used to being forgotten. And though she never expected anything from anyone again, especially not in a place like this, a seed had been planted in the still soil of her life. One man had walked away without looking back. Another, she noticed, had not yet looked away. Clara folded sheets in the kitchen's back room, her hands chapped and raw from the wash basin. She hadn't spoken more than a few words to anyone in days. The work filled the silence, and the silence dulled the ache. At night, she heard the piano from the saloon and the occasional gunshot echo in the dark. But within the thin walls of the boarding house, she kept to herself, unnoticed and unbothered. Elias Boone came in just after the dinner rush, quiet as always. He sat in the corner, eating slowly, eyes lowered. Clara served him without a word, but he looked up and thanked her, his voice low, steady. It was the first time anyone in town had said her name since Jed left her on the platform. The next day, he was there again. He asked if the bread was fresh. She nodded. The next, he asked if she had ever lived in Texas. A conversation sparked. A few sentences here and there. Elias never forced a word. He listened more than he spoke. That alone set him apart from every man Clara had known. Rumors followed Elias like a shadow. Some said he was once a gunman, hired by cattle barons. Others claimed he fought in the war, left half his body behind. Clara didn't ask. She'd learned that truth rarely came from gossip. What mattered was that he treated her with a quiet, unwavering respect. He didn't speak to her like a woman past her use. He didn't avoid her eyes. One evening, he lingered after the plates were cleared. Clara sat down across from him. He asked how she ended up in Arizona. She gave him the truth. No shame, no tears. Just the facts. He listened, never interrupting. When she finished, he said, "That man's a fool." It was all he said, but it stayed with her. Elias invited her to walk with him to the edge of town one morning. She hesitated, but agreed. They didn't speak much. The silence between them felt easy. He showed her a small plot of land he'd been clearing. A half-built cabin stood crooked, its frame sturdy but incomplete. He told her he'd lost his wife to fever 3 winters ago. Didn't see the point in rebuilding until recently, he said, looking toward the hills. She noticed he always carried things in his right hand: hammer, coffee cup, saddle strap. His left arm hung limp at the elbow, scarred and sunburnt. He never mentioned it, and Clara never asked. Pity wasn't welcome between them. They met for lunch twice a week after that, sitting on the back steps with bread and salted meat. People in town began to notice. Some looked amused. Others whispered. She ignored them. Boone brought her wildflowers once. Said he found them near the creek. She placed them in a chipped mug in her room. He never said the word love, never hinted at what might be building between them. But she noticed how his eyes softened when she laughed. She noticed how her hands trembled when he touched her shoulder in passing. One night, after a long day of work, Clara found a package outside her door. Inside was a small wooden box, hand-carved, with a polished stone set into the lid. No note, just craftsmanship, effort, and thoughtfulness. She knew it was from Elias. No one else in town would bother. Her heart, so used to guarding itself, began to stir. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, and no grand gestures came with it. Just quiet companionship. But she saw it clearly. Elias Boone saw her. Not a placeholder, not a mistake. A woman. Whole, imperfect, but worthy. She found herself waiting for him. Not out of desperation, but hope. A rare thing in this part of the world. She didn't need saving, and he didn't try. He simply stood beside her. That was enough to change everything. The town awoke to whispers when Jed Brooks returned. He rode in with a dust-covered coat and a face heavier than when he'd left. His new bride, a younger woman from New Orleans, had left him within 2 weeks, took his money, his horse, and vanished into the desert with a traveling gambler. Word spread quickly, and Clara heard it while scrubbing blood from a sheriff's shirt. She didn't react, only nodded and kept scrubbing. Jed found her 2 days later outside the boarding house, hanging linens. He called her name like nothing had passed between them. Clara turned slowly, arms full of sheets. He said he'd made a mistake, that he'd let pride speak where patience should have, that she was the kind of woman a man should build a life with. He offered to take her to his ranch, promised she'd never need to work again. Clara listened in silence. When he finished, she looked him in the eye and said, "You made it clear what I was worth to you the first time." Then she walked back inside without waiting for a reply. Elias didn't speak of Jed's return, though Clara knew he'd heard. He only asked if she was all right, and she nodded. But the town didn't stay quiet. People began to talk, louder now. Some said Clara was playing both men, others that she must be desperate to be seen with a half-crippled ex-gunman. Elias never flinched. Clara ignored the gossip until it turned sharper. One evening outside the dry goods store, a ranch hand named Collier laughed loud enough for her to hear. "Looks like Jed Scraps took to the cripple," he jeered. The men around him chuckled, but Elias, who had just stepped out with a bag of flour, turned and faced him. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't speak. He simply stared until the laughter dried up and Collier stepped back, suddenly aware of how quiet the street had become. Clara stepped forward and said, clear and without tremor, "You boys sound real brave when no one fights back." She didn't wait for an answer. She took Elias's arm, and they walked away. Later that night, she asked Elias why he never defended himself. He said, "If I let every fool drag me into a fight, I'd be buried in some ditch by now. I fight when it matters." She looked at him for a long time before saying, "It mattered to me." He nodded. Jed approached her again, this time in church. He spoke softer, more carefully. Said he didn't expect forgiveness, just wanted her to consider a second chance. Clara didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "You looked at me once and saw age, not a person. I'll never forget that." Jed didn't return after that. Mrs. Blanchard warned Clara the town could be cruel. "They don't know what to do with a woman who chooses different," she said. Clara understood. Choosing Elias meant stepping outside what was expected. A broken man and a discarded woman, neither fit the mold. But she also knew something more important. Elias had never once asked her to be anyone but herself. He didn't flinch when she spoke her mind. He didn't treat her strength as a threat or her age as a flaw. She began to see the outlines of something stronger than comfort. Mutual respect. There were no promises made yet. No rings, no talk of forever. But in a town that measured women by beauty and men by bravado, Clara and Elias stood apart. Not because they lacked those things, but because they had endured long enough to stop pretending those were what mattered. By week's end, the gossip began to fade. Not because people approved, but because Clara gave them no room to shame her. She walked beside Elias in daylight. She didn't hide. She didn't flinch. In a town full of masks, she chose truth. And that, more than anything, silenced them. Clara followed the narrow path Elias had cleared through the brush, the sound of her boots crunching dry soil beneath. The cabin stood ahead, small but sturdy, its roof shingled with care and the windows set straight. He had done it with one hand and quiet determination. She stepped inside at his gesture, the scent of cedar and dust in the air. Inside it was clean, simple. A table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves holding jars and tools. In one corner, a handmade quilt lay folded on a cot. She ran her fingers over the edge of the table. Every corner of the space felt considered, not grand, but purposeful. Elias brought her coffee in a tin cup. They sat at the table, steam rising between them. He didn't speak right away. He never rushed words. After a while, he said he built the cabin piece by piece after his wife passed. Said he didn't think he'd ever finish it until recently. Clara looked around again, understanding what he meant. It was a home for someone, not just a shelter. It had space for another life. He told her how he lost his arm. A stagecoach ambushed near Bisbee. Bandits opened fire. Elias had pulled a child behind him, took the bullet that shattered the bone. He woke 3 days later in a stranger's barn, the arm gone. His wife hadn't made it. Her name was June. They had no children. After she died, he wandered for a while, didn't see much point in staying put. But the land kept calling him back. Said he didn't want to die without building something that would outlast him. Clara listened, her hands wrapped around the cup. When he finished, she didn't offer comfort. She told him about the farm she ran alone after her husband passed. How the days blurred into one another. How she buried her father, then her mother, and finally the last hope that someone might need her. She didn't cry. Her voice was even. She said she came west not to find a husband, but to find a reason to keep trying. Elias looked at her then, not with pity, but recognition. He reached across the table with his right hand, rough fingers brushing hers. "You were never too old, Clara. They were just too small to see you." She didn't answer right away. She let the quiet settle. Then she smiled, not wide, but real. She said she'd never wanted to be saved, only seen. He nodded like he already knew that. The space between them softened. He stood and went to a shelf, pulled down a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a silver brooch, worn, scratched, but once finely made. "Was my mother's," he said. She used to say every woman should carry a piece of herself with her, something no man gave her. He placed it in Clara's hand. This is yours now, not as a gift, but a symbol. You belong nowhere but where you choose. Clara didn't hesitate. She pinned it to her dress. That simple gesture said more than any vow could. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, quietly folding into each other's presence. There were no grand declarations, no romantic speeches. Just two people who had been worn down by life, now standing steady together. When Elias finally asked if she'd stay, it wasn't a proposal. It was an invitation. No promises of riches or comfort. Just shared labor, honest company, and a place by the fire when the nights grew long. Clara accepted, not with excitement, but with a calm certainty that settled deep in her bones. That evening, she cooked while he chopped wood. They ate together in silence, content. Outside, the wind carried dust across the plain. Inside, warmth held fast. She had come west with nothing left to lose. What she found wasn't youth or security, but something far rarer: respect, understanding, and a man who never looked away. Love had not arrived in a letter. It had grown in hard soil, slow and stubborn, but had grown true.